I'm Tobias Revel.
And I'm Radha Mystery.
And this is Futur-ish, a podcast about how nothing is new and everything has happened before.
We've been working and playing in futures for over a decade of hype and bluster amidst increasing uncertainty and complexity.
In each episode, we explore a recent event or signal for its historical context and speculate on future possibilities.
And make it make sense for people like you and me.
I thought king was like a queer proximate compliment.
Yes, it was, and now it's been co-opted.
Like king and queen.
Yes,
Well,
but we
no,
have...
I'm pretty sure that was the co-option. I'm pretty sure king pre-existed.
Well, it's been co-opted once more by our protests here.
Goddamn executive privilege co-opting our queer slang.
On that note, do you want to talk to me about this thing you've been wanting to talk to me about for like 3 weeks now?
Yeah, because it's been... I was trying to remember when this thing entered my brain as a thing that I wanted to talk about. I went to an event with another one of our colleagues with the Cambridge Centre for Existential Risk, who study existential risk. So, you know, things like nuclear apocalypses through to asteroids falling out of the sky, through to, in the case of this, the collapse of communications infrastructure. And so the scenario we were role-playing was essentially what happens if the satellite networks we would use in a disaster response are taken out of action by a nefarious actor, and how do different bodies in the UK need to respond. And so as part of this workshop, they had a bunch of space people there, so people from European Space Agency and some of the people in the British space. And one of them might say, and then you get Kessler syndrome, and everyone else at the table would just look really sullen and downcast at this phrase, Kessler syndrome. And it just kept closing off conversations. And so I got really interested, and then I did in the break to say, what
is Kessler syndrome?
What is Kessler syndrome exactly? So Kessler syndrome is named after a famous NASA scientist called Donald J. Kessler, who proposed it in 1978 in a paper called, pretty excitingly, Collision Frequency of Artificial Satellites, the Creation of the Debris Belt. And basically what he hypothesized is that a situation could exist whereby the destruction of one artificial satellite, for the sake of argument for now, when I say satellite, I mean an artificial satellite, not a moon, causes a cascade where the debris from that exploding satellite hits other satellites. Those satellites also break up and their debris hits other satellites. And you basically end up, knocking out communications infrastructure, Earth observation satellites, GPS, the whole lot. Because as more of them go, it's like a nuclear explosion. It's a chain reaction. And because of the nature of space physics, it doesn't take much debris to take out a very large thing because there's no resistance.
Why aren't these satellites built more robustly?
Because space generally is pretty empty. They're not running into many things, and there's no atmosphere. They're not generally built like cars or even rockets to withstand lots of force.
I'm reading this from your notes now. Once a 1 centimeter fragment can destroy a satellite due to orbital speeds that are approximately around 28,000 kilometers per hour. So something that's like less than half an inch for those of us on this side of the pond. That is wild.
So because they're moving really fast. And if you've seen the film Gravity, that's sort of what happens there. A satellite explodes on one side of Earth, and there's a race to get out the way before all the debris starts flying back around and hitting them on the other side. And because in space it's very hard to move, because there's nothing to push against, you end up with this cascade failure. Anyway, I think there's something like 36,000 objects that are currently tracked by various space agencies that are in orbit, and those include the satellites themselves. But then there are hundreds of thousands and possibly millions of fragments of less than 10 centimeters, of space trash and debris that's out there just sort of in orbit all the time. One of the reasons why this has entered the vernacular again is because of all the new space stuff going up, like Starlink, OneWeb, the new Galileo system. It may shock you to discover that Starlink isn't as robustly regulated and checked as previous space launches have been to make sure that they're not going to end up hitting something else and causing a cascade failure. So they tend to just shoot them up, whatever the consequences. But there's also been other stuff going on. So Chinese government have been testing weapons that can take down satellites as well. In 2007, there was a test called the Fangyun anti-satellite test, where China destroyed its own weather for satellite using a missile which created 3,000 pieces of trackable debris. So remember, that's things that are 10 centimeters or over. So who knows how many pieces that are under 10 centimeters. Actually, the ISS crew, the International Space Station, were warned to take cover and be prepared that some of the debris might hit them because they didn't know where it was going to end up going and how it was going to end up flying around. 2 satellites did collide in 2009. Iridium 33 and Cosmos 2251. So a US Iridium communication satellite collided with an old Russian military satellite called Cosmos 2251, which resulted in 2,000 trackable debris fragments. It was the first accidental collision, and then since then there's been another one in 2021, which was another anti-satellite test.
Can I just ask, Tobias, like, I don't really know that much about satellites. Maybe you don't either, but with something like the defunct Russian military satellite, why is it okay for us to just leave shit out there? If these things are being decommissioned, why are we not bringing them back down to Earth so they don't pose what feels like a pretty tremendous threat to like space infrastructure?
I think some are. I think some have controlled burns in atmosphere, and they will either have a planned lifespan where after that lifespan they do start to re-enter the atmosphere and then they burn up and then, you know, land relatively harmlessly in the sea. The Soviet Union perhaps wasn't the most interested in the longevity of the environment.
I forgot about that part. That's right.
Infrastructure. They were probably just not that bothered about it.
Military satellite.
I also think at that time, a lot of these satellites were going up in the 50s and 60s, and this sort of thinking just wasn't there, right? Space was vast and limitless, and the idea that it might actually be an incredibly busy place had never sort of entered the mind. So there's 8,261 satellites in orbit at the moment, but of those 8,621 satellites in orbit, 4,852 are considered in active use. So, you know, that's about 3,500 satellites that basically aren't in use. They're just there hovering around, plus millions of pieces of debris that can start to take them out and cause this cascade failure. Now, there's 2 reasons why the Kessler syndrome is a very serious threat. The first is it takes out our communications infrastructure. It would take out GPS, lots of stuff we need for connectivity, microwave relays, all sorts of bits and bobs. And that would have a catastrophic economic impact to lose that infrastructure that allows us to move and navigate and position things and everything else. But more existentially, perhaps, and more worryingly, we wouldn't be able to fix it because there would be so much stuff in space we wouldn't be able to send anything up for hundreds of years.
What?
Well, because anything you sent up would just most likely be destroyed by debris. You'd have built a sort of cage around the Earth that you wouldn't be able to send stuff out of because of all the debris flying around.
It's not bad enough that we're polluting the planet itself. Now we're sending our trash up into space, and that is becoming a threat to humanity as well.
Yes, in short. I mean, I wouldn't say we're sending our trash into space because this stuff does have use at the point that it goes in.
But it's the same as like we have cars, and then when a car becomes, again, decommissioned or something, and it's like in a junkyard, we're treating space like a junkyard.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's relatively consequence-free. And lots of critics have pointed out that things like the Outer Space Treaty that was established in 1967 have no capability to deal with this. So those are the 2 potential effects. The immediate effect, economic catastrophe, because we would lose this communications infrastructure upon which we rely for global civilization to function at the moment as it is. The second thing is we wouldn't be able to fix it because we wouldn't be able to put anything up to replace it. So we'd have to, we just wouldn't be able to do anything about it. But then we might already be in Kessler syndrome.
Okay, say more.
It may not be something that's going to happen in the future. It may be something that has already begun with these initial collisions because that debris is now flying around. And we don't know if Kessler syndrome happens in a week or 2 or if it happens over a decade. That satellites start to go and at first it's 1 satellite, then the next year it's another satellite, then the next year it's 2, then it's 4, then it's 8, then it's 16 and blah, 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 blah. And it happens over a much longer period. Now there's some data to indicate that we might already be in Kessler syndrome. So although the number of actual collisions hasn't increased, there have been an increased amount of maneuvers to avoid collision by satellites. So in 2023, the Starlink system performed 25,299 collision avoidance maneuvers. In 2024, it was 50,000 maneuvers. So the number of maneuvers to avoid collision has doubled from 2023 to 2024, about 275 maneuvers a day. As I said earlier, Elon Musk and Starlink, not perhaps known for their safety standards, but basically keep sending up Starlink even though they don't meet a reasonable risk standard, which is a 1 in a million chance of collision. It's now 1 in 10,000 chance of collision. There's all these tests as well of anti-satellite systems which are going on, which are also increasing the chances every time. So what this made me think about in futures terms is, if you're in Paris in 1791, you don't know you're in the French Revolution. You don't know that's what that is. You just think it's just there's just some arguing going on in Paris. Some people have run down to Versailles and sat on the tennis court and come up with some stuff. And now we're all going to go back to work. You know, that was what was going on, right? You didn't realize you were in this decade-long process that would end up resulting in Napoleon and upending Europe at the time. And so I've always felt a little uncomfortable with the way we bandy about the word uncertainty as if it's an excuse for everything. We can just sort of brush it off as VUCA or, you know, whatever. So I guess what I'm thinking about here is we do have a thing called the availability heuristic. We always think about the present as the most sort of important time, because the availability of information about the present is so much easier to reach for, right? We can recall recent news stories or current news stories with a lot greater ease than we could maybe what was happening 6 months ago or a year ago. And so right now always feels like the most critical and crisis-driven point. And so part of this is a question of, like, if we were to zoom out, you know, what are we in right now? Are we in uncertainty, or is there a sort of pattern to stuff that's happening a little bit like the French Revolution or whatever it is? And how then do you bring that framing to the way that you start to think about futures, where it's not just waving your hands and saying uncertainty and running some scenarios, but saying, actually, we're probably in some sort of transition, but which we won't know until there's another generation gone. Then we look back and go, yeah, oh, this is the time where that thing happened. How do you see what you're in from inside it, is basically what I was thinking about when these people were talking about the Kessler syndrome. How do you know if you're in the Kessler syndrome or not in the Kessler syndrome?
This feels like a little bit of, I don't know, like an existential crisis. You're asking the frog to understand that it's sitting in a pot of boiling water. I don't know. Is part of it like a language thing? For example, once you name the thing, it becomes a thing, and it's not just uncertainty, right? So like if somebody had said, hey guys, this is the French Revolution, then there wouldn't be uncertainty around it because you've given it a name. And we can say that we're in a period of intense climate change and global warming. That is a period of major uncertainty. We're in this moment. I would say we're at the inflection point, right? We're at the point where something has to happen or it's not going to, but someone has named that thing, right? Why don't we know if we're in it or not?
Because of the scale. And it's interesting that you brought up the example of climate change, because one of the problems with climate change is you can't point at a thing that's climate change. You can point at the effects of climate change. You can point at heat and water and everything else and say those are impacts of climate change. But there's no thing that is climate change in and of itself.
You can't pinpoint it. So it is a series of things at varying scales, right? Depending on like what geography of the planet you inhabit at any given moment.
I guess the other thing about Kessler syndrome is it is somewhat binary, in that you either have it or you don't have it, right? It's either happening or it's not happening. There is either a satellite or there isn't a satellite. It's not a thing that has any variables. There's not some degree of it. Once it's happening, it's happening, and that's the end of satellite infrastructure. It could be that it's kind of like Hollywood, and Kessler syndrome happens, and it happens in a few weeks, and all our satellites are gone because stuff's moving really fast, and it just becomes like a nuclear chain reaction. Or it could be something that happens over years or decades. There's no way of knowing. I'm sure there are people who run that simulation.
So I have a question for you then, because so much of our practice is centered around getting folks to be comfortable with uncertainty. A lot of foresight fluency building is essentially to say, we don't know what's going to happen, but if we can speculate on the many ways forward, then perhaps we have some ability to prepare for those potential changes. But for something like this, how does that start to influence the way we think about foresight practice and the way we talk about it?
Well, so the obvious thing that comes out of this is the fragility of systems, right? If nothing else, it's a very useful design artifact for talking about the fragility of systems, because when we talk about things like trophic cascades, which I don't often, but if I was to talk about trophic cascades, then you'd be talking about how do you consider all these species and the complexity of biodiversity and how climate changes it. This is because, again, it's space and there's not much else going on. You can say, here's how one thing kicks off a chain reaction that destroys our economic condition. In a way, it's sort of more useful as a sort of horror story for strategic planners in the midst of a catastrophic failure of our economies as a result of the hubris of putting too much stuff in space. It's like our own Tower of Babel, basically, is what it is. We went too high, too fast. Now it's coming back to bite us. There's something really interesting about the idea of, like, maybe we're in it and we just don't know, that I find really, really interesting, because it feels It's the opposite of the climate change analogy. We know we're in climate change, even though we can't see it. But we can see Kessler syndrome in that it's got a limited field of operation, and either it's happening or it's not happening. We don't know what the full impact of climate change will be because it's so systemically complex. There's all these different systemic things that are connected, and we don't know what their actual effects are going to be, and if there's any potentially unforeseen mitigations, right?
Don't you think the same could be said for Kessler syndrome? Like, yes, we understand quite a few of the parameters of what could happen if our entire communication system shuts down, and like our, all of our satellite infrastructure is obliterated. But we can't foresee every single part of that system because that system is also highly complex. I guess my question to you is like, what is the benefit of knowing whether we're in it or not in this moment?
I would posit that if we were to lose GPS, that would be economic catastrophe.
Very bad. Yes.
It's possible that we'd adjust, and there have been, for instance, proposals for alternatives to GPS. A great one I saw a number of years ago was using seismic sensors, because seismic sensors' positions are also highly known and triangulatable. The problem with seismic sensors is they tend to be underground. The great thing about satellites are in the air, so they can see and point at different things quite easily and communicate quite straightforwardly, whereas seismic sensors can't. I would be confident in saying the loss of our satellite infrastructure would probably be, at a sort of macro scale, i.e. on the scale of a human lifespan, would be one of the most catastrophic events in human history. Once it starts, there's no way of stopping it. You can't just like throw up a giant net around the Earth and catch all the debris. That's it. It's going. You've got millions of pieces of debris taking out satellites flying around the Earth at tens of thousands of kilometers an hour.
But then we would have no phones, no internet.
A lot of the use of GPS is just in like checking clocks, making sure computers are talking to each other and things like that. So there are ways that could adjust, but certainly globalization and our global supply chains, both physical and digital, rely on working GPS.
And so we would just have an increasingly multipolar world.
Quite possibly. There's already alternatives going up. So Europe is launching Galileo, which is its alternative to GPS. It's not unforeseen that this starts to fragment anyway.
So there's a few different thoughts going through my head, and they might not be related to anything you've said.
I'm glad we've had this talk, Rhoda.
One is this productive towards being able to do something about the things we're finding ourselves in? Or is it productive for us to not name it and not fully understand or know it and just be able to just continue living our lives as we are?
I'm going to say the former, because I think, one of the things that folks who are worried that we might already be in Kessler syndrome are trying to say is just please stop putting up stuff in space unregulated.
But shouldn't that be a thing regardless? I think part of that is just like, you spoke a bit to like the hubris of mankind, but it's like, how did we decide that it was okay for us to do this? I feel like misled belief that we have the ability to go out and say, this is our territory, we call it our own. And that has extended all over the planet and has also historically extended out into space. I'm really interested in that treaty that you had brought up.
So a lot of the agreements and the regulations that do govern what goes up into space come from the Outer Space Treaty in 1967, which is an international agreement that still stands, the spirit of which was to prevent war going into space. So the International Outer Space Treaty was basically a no weapons in space treaty. So as a result of that, we have had a relatively peaceful but expansionist move into space, where has been historically, for instance, cooperation between the Russian government and the United States on borrowing Soyuz to send people up to the International Space Station, for example. So that has created this relatively benign and peaceful situation in space. The recent anti-satellite missile tests disregarded. But the result of that has also been then the bolting on of things like commercial space agreements that have allowed Starlink and it's Thiel's nonsense.
I think, again, we come down to the issue of like policy being heavily outdated. 1967, that's lifetimes ago at this point. The amount of change you and I have seen is insane. And so I feel like there should probably be an amendment to that treaty, don't you?
But again, what do you do if you're in Kessler syndrome? You could arguably stretch it back and say that there's a tipping point where we had too many satellites, and with the right modeling, you could say we should have stopped at 6,200 satellites. So other than going back in time and preventing more satellites,
I feel like we're just orbiting around.
Were you waiting for 45 minutes to say that?
No, I've been waiting for 15 years to say that. And I finally had the chance. What is the thing we take away from this, Tobias? Like for whoever has made it this far in this in this conversation. Where do we go from here?
The fact of it itself is interesting, right? So these space folks it was clearly weighing heavily on their minds. As I said, every time someone would sort of say, well, then we'd end up with Kessler syndrome, it would just end the conversation, because that's the end of it. That's the end of our entire field. We wouldn't be able to send anything into space, or research would be over. I don't even know what it would do for like observation from Earth. But I am fascinated by this idea of not knowing that you're maybe in the thing, right? That you're in a thing that generations later becomes a trans-historical narrative. You know, I mentioned the French Revolution earlier. You know, if you're in 1791 in Paris, you don't know you're in the French Revolution, because there hasn't been a revolution before. There's been one in the US, but that was quite an interesting novelty that's happening over there.
Sound like a sore loser, Tobias.
Well, indirectly, the American Revolution then contributed to the French Revolution by bankrupting the crown. But there was another example of 1905 in Russia. You know, in 1905, you had a year of strikes and an almost revolution. For the Tsarists, by 1907, they were like, phew, thank God that's over. That's never coming back. We'll be fine now. And for the revolutionaries, the actual Mensheviks and Bolsheviks and SRs, they were like, great, the revolution started. We're going now. They had two very different senses of times. They were now on this journey towards what ends up happening in 1917. Both of them slightly wrong in different ways, but it's interesting this, how do you know what you're in? I find myself increasingly talking about this idea of, if not uncertainty, transition. Someone made a comment to me when I was talking about a transformation project and said, when is the transformation over? And I said, well, that's not the point of transformation. You are just in a state of transformation to adapt continually to circumstances as they emerge and be open to that transformation as it happens.
Yeah.
And so maybe there's something there about, you know, putting Kessler syndrome aside for a second, about how we understand that we are just in change. We're not moving from state to state, from revolution to stability, from stability to revolution, from uncertainty back to certainty. But actually, we are constantly in a state of transformation and transition. And obviously, some people can do that naturally. And for many cultures, that's sort of a natural thing. But I think it's a struggle for, let's say, Western hegemony, when we constantly, almost nostalgically, refer to these stable states, like, say, 2001, where there was basically no interest and the economy was relatively stable, as if that is normal and everything else is unusual, when the reality is that that was unusual.
And it's a moment in a cycle in a wider system.
Yeah.
That's beautiful.
So tired.
That's beautiful.
I did 12 hours of workshops yesterday, and I was externally examining all day today.
I feel like sometimes you do these things to yourself, but I have the same problem, so.
Next week. It's your turn, and it better be better than Kessler syndrome, because I ran out of steam.
How do I top Kessler syndrome? Anyway, friend, have a good evening.
Bye-bye.